The dust on Elias Thorne's land wasn't just dirt, it was a testament to broken dreams. Every gust of wind that swept across his parched fields felt like it was trying to scour away the last memory of his wife, Eleanor. She had seen life in this valley, a future carved out of stubborn soil and endless sky. Elias now only saw her grave, a simple wooden cross overlooking a homestead that was slowly turning to bones. He was 37, but the grief and the sun had etched 50 years into his face. He kept his promise to her, though. He stayed. He endured. He fought for the scrap of earth she had called their Eden. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the lone cottonwood, by the well, a figure stumbled out of the twilight. He was a man running on his last nerve, clothes torn, one arm held tight against his chest, his face a mask of dried blood and exhaustion. He collapsed near the water trough, his breathing a ragged, painful sound in the immense silence of the prairie. Elias watched from his porch, his hand resting on the worn stock of the rifle leaning against the wall. Every instinct screamed danger. A man in that condition was either running from the law or running from something worse. The smart thing to do, the safe thing, was to leave him be, to let the desert claim him. But then Elias saw the man's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of a hunted animal, filled with a pain so profound it transcended language or allegiance. In that moment, he didn't see a threat. He saw a human being at the very edge of his existence. He saw the same desperation he felt every morning when he woke up alone. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole territory, Elias laid his rifle aside. He walked over, knelt, and offered the man his canteen. The fugitive drank like a man who had forgotten the feeling of water, long, desperate gulps. When he was done, he tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Elias helped him to his feet and guided him into the small, Spartan cabin. It wasn't much. A cot, a cold stove, a single table. On that table sat Elias's supper, one hard biscuit and the last thin strip of salted jerky. It was all he had until he could next get to town, a trip he could barely afford. Without a word, he broke the biscuit in half and pushed the plate toward the stranger. The man looked at the meager meal, then at Elias, and a flicker of disbelief, of profound gratitude passed through his exhausted eyes. They ate in silence, the quiet communion of two men who had nothing left but the moment in front of them. The fugitive finally found his voice, a low, cultured whisper that didn't match his ragged appearance. "They will come for me," he said, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. "You should not have done this." Elias just shook his head. "A man's got to eat," he replied, though he knew they were talking about more than just food. He had shared his last meal, an act that felt both foolish and deeply necessary, a quiet rebellion against a world that had taken everything from him. As the fugitive drifted into an exhausted sleep on the cot, Elias cleaned the man's wound. It was a clean bullet hole straight through the shoulder. This was no simple outlaw. The next morning the fugitive was gone. The only sign he had ever been there was half a biscuit left on the table and a small, intricately carved wooden bird left on the cot. A token, a thank you. Elias felt a strange sense of peace. He had done the right thing. He had honored the part of himself that Eleanor had loved best. That peace lasted less than an hour. It was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. Not one rider, but dozens. Elias stepped onto his porch, and his heart turned to ice. Cresting the ridge was Silas Blackwood, the cattle baron who owned the valley and everything in it, save for Elias's small plot. Blackwood rode a jet-black stallion, a stark figure of wealth and menace, flanked by his two most ruthless foremen. Blackwood didn't dismount. He looked down at Elias and his small, failing ranch with undisguised contempt. "Thorne," he boomed, his voice like grinding rocks. "Your time is up." He spat a wad of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "I've been patient. I've let you grieve your woman and play farmer on this dust bowl, but my patience has run out. This land is mine, Blackwood," Elias said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "The deed is filed and legal." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your deed isn't worth the paper it's printed on. I hold the territorial grant, all of it." He unrolled a scroll of paper and threw it on the ground. It was an official-looking document, stamped with a wax seal Elias had never seen before. An eviction notice. "You have 15 days," Blackwood snarled. 15 days to clear out, or my men will clear you out, and they won't be as gentle as this piece of paper. The ticking clock had begun. 15 days to save his home, 15 days to keep his promise to Eleanor. As Blackwood and his men rode away, their laughter echoing across the valley, Elias felt the familiar grip of despair tighten around him. The first day was marked by silence, the second by isolation. When Elias rode into the town of Redemption for supplies, he found himself a ghost. At the general store, old Mr. Abernathy, a man who had shared stories with Elias for 5 years, suddenly couldn't meet his eye. "Can't offer you credit today, Elias," he mumbled, busying himself under the counter. "Times are tight." Elias saw one of Blackwood's men watching from the corner of the saloon, a smirk on his face. The message was clear. The entire town was now Blackwood's instrument. Friends averted their gaze. Doors that were once open were now closed. He was an island, and the tide was rising. On the 5th day, the isolation became a direct betrayal. His only neighbor, a weary farmer named Jebediah, had always shared access to the creek that marked their property line. That morning, Elias found a newly erected fence, sharp and aggressive, cutting him off from the water. Jebediah stood on the other side, his face a portrait of shame. "I'm sorry, Elias," he called out, his voice barely a whisper. "Blackwood's men. They told me if I didn't, my own family would pay the price." From his opulent ranch house overlooking the entire valley, Silas Blackwood swirled a glass of brandy. His foreman, a hard man named Cole, stood before his desk. "Thorne is holding on," Cole reported. "The town has shut him out. Jebediah put up the fence, but he's not breaking." Blackwood took a slow sip, his eyes cold and calculating. "Psychological pressure is a delicate art, Cole. We have pushed him. Now we squeeze. I don't want him dead. I want him broken. I want him to beg me to take this land off his hands." He leaned forward, the firelight glinting in his eyes. "Go to the headwaters of the creek, the part that runs through my northern range. Build a dam, a small one, mind you. Not enough to dry up the creek bed entirely, just enough to turn his water source into a muddy trickle. Let him watch his own well run dry. Let him watch the earth crack. Let him feel the land dying beneath his feet. A man can endure loneliness. He can endure hunger. But no man can watch his own hope turn to dust." By the 14th day, Blackwood's cruelty had borne its bitter fruit. The creek was a ribbon of mud. The well was nearly dry. The cornstalks in Elias's small garden were brown and brittle, skeletons rattling in the wind. All was lost. He had failed. He sat at the table in the suffocating silence of the cabin, the eviction notice a death sentence lying before him. Tomorrow Blackwood would come. Tomorrow he would lose the last piece of Eleanor left in the world. His spirit shattered. He began to pack the few things that mattered. He opened Eleanor's old hope chest, the scent of cedar and lavender, a painful memory. Inside were her simple dresses, a book of poetry, a pressed wildflower. He ran his hand along the bottom of the chest, a final, desperate touch, and his fingers brushed against a loose board. His heart skipped a beat. He pried it open. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment, and inside that compartment, wrapped in oilcloth, was a document. His hands trembled as he unrolled it. It was old, the parchment thick and yellowed with age, the ink faded but clear. The writing was elegant, looping script, but it wasn't English. It was Spanish. At the bottom was a heavy, intricate seal made of dark red wax, bearing the crest of the Spanish crown. Tucked inside was a more recent translated copy, notarized by a territorial judge from 20 years prior. It was an original Spanish land grant, issued by the King of Spain in 1788. It granted title of the entire valley, all 50,000 acres, to one General Alejandro de la Vega and his descendants, in perpetuity. It was an ironclad claim that predated the United States, predated the territorial government, and made Silas Blackwood's grant look like a child's scribble. Elias stared at it, his mind reeling. Eleanor must have found it, hidden it, a secret weapon for a day just like this. A wave of triumphant, hysterical laughter escaped his lips. It was a miracle, a voice from the grave. He hadn't just saved his small farm. He held the key to the entire valley. Blackwood wasn't just a trespasser on his land. He was a trespasser on De La Vega land, and Elias held the proof. Clutching the deed, he saddled his horse and rode for redemption like a man possessed. Hope, fierce and bright, burned in his chest. As he neared the town, he saw it, a sight that made him pull his horse to a halt. The town square was swarming with men, not Blackwood's thugs. These were lawmen, Dozens of them. U.S. Marshals, territorial rangers, county deputies from 3 different districts. It had to be over 100 men, all heavily armed, their horses filling every hitching post. They were organizing, preparing for a siege. At their center stood a man with cold, authoritative eyes and a silver star pinned to his chest, a federal marshal. Elias's first thought was that Blackwood's reign was finally over. The law had come to bring him to justice. With a surge of renewed confidence, Elias rode forward, dismounted, and pushed through the crowd, holding the Spanish deed aloft like a holy relic. "Marshal," he called out, his voice ringing with victory. "Marshal, I have something you need to see. This document will prove Silas Blackwood is nothing but a thief and a land grabber." The federal marshal turned, his expression unreadable. He took the ancient document from Elias's hand, his eyes scanning the Spanish script, then the wax seal. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He didn't look at Elias. Instead, he looked past him, toward a new wanted poster that had been nailed to the sheriff's office wall. On it was a sketch of a face Elias knew all too well, the exhausted, hunted fugitive he had shared his last meal with. The marshal's gaze returned to Elias, and it was as cold as a grave. "This document," he said, his voice dangerously low, "is the De La Vega grant. It's been missing for 10 years, ever since the last heir was accused of treason against the United States." He pointed a single damning finger at the wanted poster. "That man, Mateo de la Vega, he's wanted for sedition, conspiracy, and for the assassination of Governor Carlisle. And according to our informant, after he escaped federal custody 2 nights ago, he was given food and shelter by an isolated farmer at the edge of this valley." The marshal took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through Elias like a knife. "You didn't just share a meal with a fugitive, son. You aided and abetted the most wanted traitor in the territory." He raised his voice to a full-throated command that echoed through the square. "This man is his accomplice. Surround his ranch. Find De La Vega. Burn the place to the ground if you have to." A stunned silence fell over the square. The townsfolk, who had moments before been a sea of averted eyes, now stared openly, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning horror. Elias felt the ground drop out from under him. The one pure thing he had done, the one act that had reawakened his own humanity, had just been twisted into a noose. Before the marshal's men could even turn their horses, a voice, high and trembling, cut through the tension. "He's lying." All eyes turned. It was Jebediah, his neighbor. He was pushing his way through the crowd, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a desperate fire. He stumbled to a stop in front of the marshal, clutching his worn hat in his hands. Not about the fugitive," he stammered, glancing at Elias with a pained apology. "About Elias, about us." Silas Blackwood, who had been observing from the edge of the square with a triumphant smirk, spurred his horse forward. "Pay no mind to this fool, Marshal. He's just a dirt scratcher trying to protect his friend." "He threatened my family!" Jebediah shouted, his voice finally finding its strength. He pointed a shaking finger at Blackwood. "He sent his men to my home. He said if I didn't fence off the creek, if I didn't help starve Elias out, my wife and children would meet with an accident. He made me do it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The federal marshal's eyes narrowed, shifting from Jebediah to Blackwood, whose smirk had frozen on his face. Then another voice joined in. "He's telling the truth." Old Mr. Abernathy stepped out from his store, his face grim. "Blackwood's foreman told me my supply wagons from the east would never arrive again if I sold so much as a nail to Elias Thorne. He said he owned this town, and everyone in it." Suddenly, the dam of fear broke. One by one, the people of redemption began to speak. A blacksmith confessed that Blackwood had threatened to foreclose on his shop. A stable hand admitted he was forced to report on Elias's comings and goings. The silent, hostile town was revealed for what it was, a community held hostage, its silence not an act of betrayal, but one of terrified self-preservation. Their collective guilt and fear, ignited by Jebediah's courage, was turning into a blaze of open defiance. The marshal held up a hand, silencing the chorus of accusations. He looked at Blackwood, whose face was now a mask of cold fury. "This complicates things, Mr. Blackwood. These are the desperate lies of peasants," Blackwood roared. "The issue is the traitor this man harbored, the only traitor in this valley." A calm voice declared from behind the crowd, "Is you, Silas." The townsfolk parted like the Red Sea. Walking toward them, his head held high, was the fugitive. He was clean-shaven now, his clothes simple but neat. The the wound on his arm bandaged. All that remained of the hunted animal was the intensity in his eyes. It was Mateo de la Vega. He walked straight past the stunned lawman and stopped beside Elias, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder before turning to face the marshal. "My name is Mateo de la Vega," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "That grant is my birthright. Governor Carlisle was a friend to my family. He was investigating Blackwood for massive fraud and for the murder of prospectors who had found gold on his northern range. I was bringing the governor proof, this very land grant, which proves Blackwood's claim is illegal." Mateo's gaze was unwavering. "The governor wasn't assassinated. He was ambushed. Blackwood's men killed him, and his paid informant, one of your own men, Marshal, named me as the killer to stop the investigation and seize my ancestral land. I did not flee from justice. I fled from a hangman's noose tied by the man who stood to gain everything from my death." Blackwood let out a derisive laugh. "An unbelievable story from a wanted man. Where is your proof?" The marshal looked from De La Vega's resolute face to Blackwood's sneering one. He turned to his lead deputy. "Where is the informant, the man who identified De La Vega?" The deputy pointed toward a group of Blackwood's riders. "That's him, sir. Cole, on the bay horse." All eyes fell on Cole, Blackwood's ruthless foreman. He looked like a cornered wolf, his eyes darting between his boss, the marshal, and the gallows that stood waiting in the town square. "Cole," the marshal said, his voice like iron, "you will give your testimony, now." Cole looked at Blackwood, who gave him a barely perceptible shake of the head, but it was too late. Cole saw the faces of the townsfolk, heard their confessions, and knew the tide had turned. He saw the cold resolve of the federal marshal and knew there was no escape. His loyalty to Blackwood dissolved in the acid of self-preservation. "It's true," Cole whispered, his voice cracking. "All of it. Blackwood, he paid me. He paid me to name De La Vega. He said the governor was going to ruin him, that it was the only way." The confession hung in the air, absolute and damning. Silas Blackwood's empire, built on fear and lies, crumbled to dust in a single moment. He yanked on his horse's reins, preparing to bolt, but the marshal's men were already upon him, pulling him from his saddle and binding his hands. The reign of terror was over. 3 months later, the sun shone on a valley transformed. The creek flowed freely, the fields were turning green, and the fence that had separated neighbors was gone. The De La Vega grant was honored by the federal courts, and Mateo, his name cleared, was the rightful owner of the valley. His first official act was to sign a new deed, granting Elias Thorne his farm and the surrounding 100 acres, in perpetuity. Elias stood on his porch, watching the corn grow tall. The town of Redemption was alive again, its people no longer ruled by fear, but bound by the shared memory of their courage. He had not only kept his promise to Eleanor, he had helped restore the very soul of the community she had so loved. He looked out toward her grave on the hill and felt not grief, but a profound and lasting peace. He had shared his last biscuit, and in doing so, had inherited a future he could never have imagined. Elias Thorne proved that a single act of compassion, offered without expectation, can be the spark that ignites a fire of courage in the hearts of many. The spirit of the West lives on in tales like these. To hear more stories of unlikely heroes and the enduring power of moral courage, subscribe to our channel and become a guardian of their legacy.